Well, hi, and welcome again to Aspect Ministries' virtual tour of Israel. I'm Dr. Michael Bogart, your guide. If you've been part of our tour so far, you may have picked up on the fact that in the background segments before the actual on-site footage, I tend to spend quite a bit of time explaining the setting and advocating for the Christian faith. This type of thing is often called apologetics. So, apologetics is the explanation and defense of the Christian faith. And from time to time throughout this virtual tour, I will be talking about some of the evidence for things like the reliability of the Bible and other elements of the Christian faith, along with life lessons we can learn from what we're seeing. Now, at this stop on our tour, we'll briefly take in two separate sites. The first of these will be at the gates of the ruined city of Dan, the northernmost city of ancient Israel, which now is right on the border with Lebanon. Then we'll stop at Qumran, the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered around 70 years ago. We'll see that both of these sites were connected with the significant pieces of evidence for the truthfulness of the Bible. So first, let's look at the gates of Dan. I know the quality of this on-site video could be better, but it was late in the day and the lighting was a nightmare, so bear with us. This is Dan in the extreme north part of Israel. You can see behind me right there that low structure with the row of stones, kind of a low stone wall with some bigger stones piled on top. That is an altar, and it would be an altar of sacrifice right here at the main gate to the city of Dan. Interesting archaeological find there, a little inscription on a stone that said Beit David. And basically that means house of David. Of course, the problem is that David is spelled in Hebrew with the letters D, V, and D, the equivalent of D, V, and D. And so it really brings up an issue of what you accept. I mean, do you accept that as evidence that David is mentioned there? Because that's the logical thing. House of David is mentioned throughout the Bible. But on the other hand, you know, if you're a skeptic, just the mention of the house of something with the consonants D, V, and D in it doesn't necessarily prove David. It just goes to show that if a person is wanting to believe, this would be pretty good evidence because it corresponds with so much of the biblical evidence. If you're a skeptic, nothing's going to really persuade you. You're always going to find reasons not to believe. You're always going to think there's alternative explanations. It's really a more matter of psychology than anything else. And so it's important to approach things with the eyes of faith. Just trust that God knows what he's doing. And to be skeptical really doesn't lead anywhere. It leads to basically the idea that you don't know anything and can't prove anything. So we approach things with the eyes of faith. I jokingly like to call this site the place where the oldest recorded DVD in the world was found. Really? Well, of course, no DVD disc was found under the rubble, but an inscription was found that would read, if it were in English letters, BYT DVD, House of David. Now understand that biblical Hebrew didn't have consistent vowel characters like we do in English, you know, A, E, I, O, and U. It had vowel indicators, but it didn't have a consistent system of letters for vowel sounds as we understand them. So there could be several possible readings of that series of letters, D, V, and D, depending upon which vowel sounds you put in between the consonants. The most probable would be Beit David, or House of David. I suppose there could be other possible readings if you put other vowel sounds in the spaces, but I'd put my money on House of David. For one thing, who would take the time and expense to carve something unimportant or trivial into an inscription at an important city gate? But a city that belonged to the royal house of David, or the conquest of a city belonging to the house of David, now those types of things would rate such an inscription. In other words, you don't devote public monuments to trivial things. So Beit David, House of David, makes sense. Why is this finding of an inscription referring to the royal house of David so important? Well, because some famous scholars who study ancient Israel have claimed that there was no King David, that he was just a legend like Batman or some other superhero. They claim that no record of David exists outside the Bible itself, and that this proves that the Bible is just a collection of myths. Yet digging in the ruins of this ancient gate at the city of Dan archaeologists came upon something that's almost certainly a reference to the royal house of David. And you can claim that the inscription refers to something else if you want to stick with your narrative that David never existed, but I think that here we have independent confirmation of one of the most pivotal characters in the Bible. Then there's Qumran. In 1947, an Arab shepherd happened upon an ancient manuscript portion of the Old Testament in a cave at the northern end of the Dead Sea at a location known as Qumran. The shepherd sold the manuscript to somebody who recognized its real significance as an ancient portion of the Bible. And from that moment, the hunt was on for more of these ancient copies of the Bible. In all, between 800 and 900 documents have been discovered so far, including portions from every book in the Old Testament except Esther. Plus, many other types of writings were found in that same place that were used by the Jewish community that lived on that site from around 200 BC to around 100 AD. And up until the finding of these documents, now called the Dead Sea Scrolls, many critics of the Bible, especially in universities in Europe and North America, claimed that the Bible had been changed drastically since its original documents were written. You know, they use that same old argument about the gossip example, in which an original story gets more and more distorted as more and more people pass it along. The claim that it was over the years, each time the Old Testament was copied, mistakes or changes were made, so that now we have no idea what the originals actually said. The argument was supposed to show that the Bible might be an interesting religious document, but it can't really be trusted to be accurate about anything it reports on, and it's therefore largely irrelevant to life in our times. Now, up until the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, the oldest copies of the Old Testament books anyone knew anything about only dated from around the Middle Ages, that is around 900 AD. So there was a huge time gap from the years before Christ, BC, when the last of the Old Testament books were written, to 900 AD, the oldest copies of these books that we knew anything about. Since it was these medieval copies that were used as the basis for our Bibles up until 1947, well, these skeptical scholars claimed that too many changes had probably happened during those centuries to trust that the Bible is accurate. But then came the bombshell finding at Qumran in 1947. What the Dead Sea Scrolls actually prove is that the copies from the 900s AD, you know, the medieval copies that we'd been using as the basis for our Bibles up until 1947, were remarkably accurate when compared to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date from the 100s BC. In other words, there were very few differences compared to the far older Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Old Testament books had been faithfully and accurately copied by Jewish scribes between 200 BC and 900 AD, fully 1,000 years. Which actually proves that the copying of the Bible hasn't changed much over time. Those skeptics that claim so confidently that the Bible's not accurate or trustworthy, well, they suffered a terrible blow at Qumran. Of course, most of them will never admit that inconvenient truth, and they just keep on spreading their skeptical narrative, never mind the evidence. As I mentioned at another stop on our tour, a lot of the debate about whether evidence supports or contradicts the Bible hinges on the personal commitments people begin with. So if you're convinced that the Bible is just a collection of ancient fables and religious propaganda, then you'll probably ignore any evidence that points to its truthfulness. And you will play up anything that seems to support your skeptical view. But if you think the Bible is an authentic record of people who encountered God in some way, or that God himself may have been involved in its writing and preservation, then evidence to support that view will literally jump out at you nearly every stop along this tour. So, now come with Melinda and me to the ancient city of Dan and to the site of Qumran by the northern end of the Dead Sea. Let's go. This is Dan, the most northern city of ancient Israel. Dan was one of the places where there was an altar built originally for the worship of the God of Israel. You can see the metal structure that represents the shape of that altar there in that place of sacrifice. But because it was a northern outpost, they were susceptible to a lot of influences of pagan religions. Nature culture religions. We're very close to Caesarea Philippi here, which was notorious for being a place of corruption and paganism. And so It shows the exposed, I guess you'd say, nature of Israel. The tribe of Dan up here, exposed, surrounded by all sorts of other cultures, and the difficulty it is to stay true to the worship of God when you're influenced by so many other kinds of things. It takes a certain kind of person to do it, and the tribe of Dan was not very successful at being able to maintain their purity in the midst of a sea of compromise. This is Qumran, way out in the desert. In front of me there is the Dead Sea, the northern end of the Dead Sea, and right here behind me are the caves of Qumran, or the places where the Dead Sea Scroll was found. In some of these caves up on that mountainside, number of caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Dead Sea Scrolls discovered beginning in 1947, and important in the sense that they are proofs that the text that we have of the Old Testament, the Hebrew text that we have of the Old Testament, is very accurate, that what we're translating from into English or whatever other language they're being translated into is based upon something that has not been made up, that's not been miscopied or changed over the years, but that we're translating from something that is very old and has been very accurately preserved. So Dead Sea Scrolls right here, the Old Testament text, carefully preserved for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years right here in Israel.